Today we're taking on one of the most controversial bottles in the world of bourbon. I am, of course, talking about Blanton's. This bottle that you see here, if you're watching the video version, is empty because I finished it while having a conversation about Blanton's that, honestly, I learned so much that blew my mind about the brand and the history of bourbon in the United States and all of those sorts of things. But before we get to that, what's up, guys? My name is Chris, and you're listening to the Whiskey Noobs podcast. And today I got to have an awesome conversation with Dominic Guglielmi. He is the author of the book Warehouse H. For those of you watching the video version, it is, of course, the book that I'm holding here. And he wrote the book Warehouse H about the history of Blanton's and how it has grown to become this incredibly influential bourbon. Whether you think it's good or not is besides the point. We do touch on that a little bit. We touch on whether it's worth the money, maybe how you could have some chances at finding it if you're somebody who's looking for it. But that's not the main topic. The main topic is really the history of bourbon and of Blanton's and what shaped Blanton's and how Blanton's shaped the bourbon industry throughout the past few decades. And it was a really fun conversation because I got to ask questions that I personally have had about Blanton's and about the distilleries at the time that I couldn't find out. Like it's not easy info to find, but Dominic had just done so much research for this book that I was able to ask him these questions that I was able to really nerd out. So if you're into nerding out about the history of bourbon, the culture, and the history of Blanton specifically in the way that I am, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Not only do we talk about like where it came from and things like that, but we also talk about myths and legends that have developed over the years that actually aren't true. And that for me was very interesting because, as I'm sure you guys do, I hear those things online all the time. So without further ado, I'm going to cut to my interview with Dominic Guglielmi, the author of Warehouse H. I have something specific that I want to start with because no matter what you say about Blanton's on the internet, whatever take you have, somebody's going to love it and somebody's going to hate it. So I thought in order to cushion that a little bit, let's just start off with your background, who you are, sure, and your perspective coming into the whiskey world and where you are now with whiskey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thanks for having me. Great to be here. And, I got into this journey of bourbon and whiskey through Blanton's, which is really an introductory bottle for so many people. I started probably 2017. I was gifted a bottle, and I actually write this story in the book, but essentially I wanted to collect the horses. I wanted to collect the different variations of Blanton's that I found on the internet. And I found there was several, and soon I discovered there was these international varieties and things like that. So I was very intrigued by it for the taterness of it. It was fun. It was new and it was exciting for me. And it just had an allure to it. I wasn't sophisticated and still don't proclaim to be the most sophisticated bourbon drinker. I know Blanton's is not the best. I certainly understand that. But, there was an allure to the brand, I guess, for me. And after that, it became this rabbit hole of collecting and then ultimately culminated in writing the book just based on the knowledge and experience that I gained tracking the brand. So it was really a multi-year journey, and here we are. And I'm real happy to be able to share this book and a lot of Blanton's knowledge with the world.
Yeah, and I love to hear that too, because I think that it's great to see that you're coming from the hobbyist perspective, the enthusiast perspective. This isn't you were hired to write something about something that right. You don't care about. This is coming from an intrigue in Blanton's, which I know so many people listening have, for better or worse, no matter which side of it they're coming from. It's an very intrigue polarizing. In Blanton's. Yeah. So now you mentioned in 2017 was when you first started trying Blanton's, drinking it.
Yep.
Now, what was the landscape like? I was not of legal drinking age at that point, so I'm curious what it was looking like.
Well, what was interesting, bourbon has been on a boom for the past, probably going on 15 years now, but really the last 10 years, it's been super strong. And of course, COVID propelled it to new highs. Back then, it was similar to what it is today, just, maybe just a few less people into it, but it was already impossible to find many of the allocated bourbons, in the stores, especially in states like Ohio, where you and I both live, just flies off the shelf when it's at standard retail pricing. So The scene wasn't much different. There was certain brands that you could find probably more easily than you do today. Certain ones that hadn't quite, the hype train hadn't caught up with them yet. But for the most part, it was already kind of a difficult task. Now, specific to Blanton's, what I can tell you is within the rare bottle collecting community, which I certainly partake in, there's a few of them behind me for those watching the video. Back then, they were more obtainable. There are releases that Buffalo Trace sends every year to France, for example, and those releases, there's 2, 3, 4, 5 barrels worth that they do. Back then you could still find some of the early releases. You could still find, some of the early 2000s releases that they did in those, for those markets. Now you just can't find those bottles. They're just impossible. They've been snapped up by collectors or otherwise consumed.
Okay, yeah, that's actually really good to know. I hadn't thought about the overseas stuff, and that's actually one of the questions I had for you was about how that all works, what the different varieties of Blantons are, because I am not into the rare stuff enough to really know about it. So is that where most of these bottles you see with the wild labels, like you mentioned behind you and things like that, those are coming from overseas then? Yeah,
exactly. And I started my journey, as I mentioned, by wanting to just collect the currently produced varieties. And most readers, most listeners will understand that that we have Blantons in the U.S. More recently, they've started offering the gold and the straight from the barrel variants. And beyond that, there's other Japanese specific labels. So there's 7 currently produced. That includes both versions of the gold label. A lot of people forget there's a Japanese version of the gold, but 7 currently produced. And as I found out about those, I wanted to own them all. And I was at the time traveling for work to Japan quite frequently. So I was able to obtain those 7, and I really thought I had the lineup. I thought I had the full Blanton's collection. The problem is, and as you referenced, you get into sort of Googling Blanton's and you find there's a lot of other labels, things that are just, what is this bizarre thing? So that's what led me to create my website, warehouseage.com, just to catalog it. I just wanted to, basically provide an informational source, because I got tired of seeing the same bottles pop up in different groups and Facebook and things where people are asking questions and saying, what is this? And the same answers will be given, sometimes erroneously. So I just created the website to document the brand more as a catalog. And then from there went down that rabbit hole, again, of collecting, trying to seek out these bottles. And I had such good fortune along the way. I was able to really find numerous bottles that are so rare that there's only a few of them that are known to exist, and just had a very widespread network of people helping me out, searching for those bottles. And I'm proud to have some pretty cool ones in my collection now.
Wow. Yeah, that's really exciting. And then, so the book or the website came before the book. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that was 2000. That before you even had the idea you wanted to write the book?
Yeah.
This was, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The website really just was, and still is, pretty much a catalog, a picture catalog of all the bottles. It has the known barrel numbers for those rare releases, and it has some other basic information. Outside of that, it was not a history. It was not, I have a blog out there that I rarely update. It was just really just a pictorial reference guide for people. So the book materialized because after I pretty much collected all the rare bottles, I'm missing 3 at the moment, from the known the known library of Blanton's rare bottles. After I pretty much collected them all, the fun was in the chase. It was in the hunt. And so I couldn't, I needed something to satisfy sort of that, scratch that itch, I guess. And with that, the concept of the book was born, because I had gained so much knowledge. And I guess I'm kind of a perfectionist. I get tired of seeing people post things and you're like, oh, that's not right. And I don't want to be the guy to correct them and come across that way. But, there's so many times factual information was not really factual. And I think what solidified it for me was seeing even other writers. I'm not going to name names, but other writers, well-known people who didn't always quite get the story right, not because they were faulty in their research, but because some of the stories about Blanton's have been told over and over so long that we just accept them as true. And we don't know
Mm.
that there's more to the story. And it wasn't that they were blatantly, patently false. It was just there was more to the story. And I had already known some of that, and I said, let's do it. Let's dive in, and let's try to create something here that honors the brand, and hopefully something people want to read.
Absolutely. So how, if you're totally right, we tell all these legends about it that they just get told over and
Yeah.
over again. So in what way were you able to unearth which ones were myth and which ones were real? Was it just from all of the research accumulating, or how'd you go about that?
Yeah, significant research. I went, I've been to Japan multiple times. France for La Maison de Whiskey, which is where they release annual Blanton's releases. Those trips are great, but the real research that got me things and answers that others maybe didn't quite know or hasn't been fully told came right here in the U.S. from people that were associated with the brand in the early years. I became sort of an investigative journalist and trying to track people down and, Google them and find, these names. So sometimes people are fairly elderly, to get them to, talk to me to say, hey, I'm writing a book. Will you give me some information about your time, maybe back at Buffalo Trace, back, 30 years ago. And so, yeah, I found some really cool stuff. And if you'd like, I'll give you a few examples of some of those erroneous.
That would be great. That's
things
my next question.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah. So probably the biggest one is that I see repeated all the time is that Blanton's was first released in Japan. Back in the 80s, bourbon was in a real glut, or a real dry spell here in the U.S. It was the bottom of the market. Nobody wanted it, and there was a bourbon glut where basically there was all this surplus bourbon, and it was aging. They couldn't sell it fast enough. Meanwhile, you had Japan, who at the time were seeing a very large increase in their love of bourbon. It had started in the 70s and continued through the 80s. And so that East meets West happened. And you saw this infusion of Japanese purchasing of American brands, such as eventually in 1992, Age International, the brand owner of Blanton's, and other distilleries as well, even since then. But where was Blanton's first released and why was it released? It was Japan, it was the United States. It released here first in the fall of '84. Japan didn't get it until 1985. So there was a lot of desire to sell in the Japanese market, and the product they knew would sell better there. But the owners of the distillery at the time, two gentlemen named Ferdy Falk and Robert Baranascus, they very much wanted a top shelf bourbon here in the U.S. And I see that sort of story continuously condensed down to Blanton's was made for Japan and first distributed there, and then came here. Little bit of a story around that.
Okay, that's a really good example because you're absolutely right that gets kind of propagated sometimes. So I imagine in the book you're kind of going throughout and you're talking about the whole timeline, the whole history, but you're kind of unearthing these little Easter eggs of misinformation that have made their way online.
Yeah. Some other examples.
Go ahead.
Would be Elmer T. Lee. I love Elmer. I've said this to a few folks recently in different interviews and things. Elmer's great. He's a legend, but he gets this sort of sole credit for creating Blanton's and the background of it. And this is a theme that I write about throughout the book. It's probably one of the larger topics I carry through the entire book. That is that Ferdy Falk and Bob Baranascus, the two owners at the time, they challenged Elmer to make Blanton's or to find the Blanton's product in the warehouse. They wanted to make money. They were trying to expand the distillery. They were doing other things at the time, contract distillation for other brands. They were importing different wines, beers, liquors, exporting things. They were very much involved in multiple facets of alcohol distribution, not just manufacturing. And so they were hustlers. They wanted to make money, and they told Elmer, find us something good. We want a $25 bourbon, and we need to be able to figure out how to sell something that's worthy of that price point back in 1984. So, Elmer, as the story goes, remembered Albert Blanton, the legendary Colonel Blanton's favorite preference for sugar barrels or honey barrels, special barrels that are aged in the warehouse and have better better flavor based on their aging techniques in the wood, location of the warehouse, etc. So Elmer taps into that legend, and he goes out to the warehouse, and he finds, the premium barrels, and then they say, perfect, let's bottle this one barrel at a time. First single barrel product, Blanton's. Yeah, that's great. Well, it wasn't like Elmer was the only one that knew that the single barrels certain barrels throughout the warehouse, rather, were better. Everybody knew that. The warehouse foreman, the Ferdy and Bob, everybody knew that there was always good barrels throughout the warehouse. Just nobody had the guts to kind of put them into a single barrel product at that point and not mingle them all together. So if it weren't for Ferdy and Bob's tenacity and desire to make money, Elmer was, he was ready to retire. He wasn't like sitting there every day in a think tank trying to create new marketing strategies. So it's a bit of a marketing ploy that he gets all the credit. And I try to give credit to Ferdy and Bob.
Yeah, and what a bizarre thing to think about at the time is single barrel had never been done. So, and you're right that I've heard the story up to this point that it's just like wise old Elmer knew, he's like, I got it, and I want to have this, groundbreaking bourbon. That little bit of info is vital, I think, to understand. Sometimes we might ask ourselves, why don't we see things like this right now? Or why doesn't this distiller, why doesn't that person come up with this amazing type of idea? And it might be that you don't understand the societal and the management pressure at the time. Mm-hmm. It was not just this artistic vision that he suddenly had, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. And I think Ferdy and Bob, I don't know how you market a story with the name Ferdy and Bob Baranascus, Ferdy Falk, Bob Baranascus, Elmer T. Lee, Albert Blanton, those are Kentucky names. They certainly have the pedigree, and so they get the credit. But there is more to the story, that's for sure. And I spoke quite a bit with Ferdy Falk's son, who really was instrumental in kind of providing me, details on what it was like back then. Both in the market, the industry, and then how Blanton's was formed.
Wow. Now, what was that like as you're going through and doing these interviews? I mean, I imagine that had to be incredibly exciting to be kind of unearthing these truths as you wrote the book.
Yeah, it was. There was probably the hard part was sometimes having to correct even the people that I was interviewing when knowledge that I gained somewhere else maybe conflicted. Example of that would be, and I hope he never watches this or listens, but Chris Falk, who's an awesome guy, by the way, told a story, and actually do reference this in the book as well, about him recalling his father drawing the Blanton's bottle on a napkin while they were sitting in a Midtown Manhattan bar restaurant. And he sort of alluded to it being almost like his father's design or something that was invented there within the family or the business. One of the people who I was able to connect with, it was a great informational source for my book, was Adam D'Addario, he was part of a family that had a design agency, and they were based in New York City. Blanton's, or rather Age International at the time, worked with their agency to effectively design the label, to come up with the box, the packaging, etc. And they worked with D'Addario to source the bottle that was previously used 2 times before Blanton's. So it wasn't Elmer T. Lee that created the bottle design, which some folks at Buffalo Trace still proclaim to this day. It wasn't Mr. Ferdy Falk, who owned one of the owners at the time. It really was a bottle that had been used as far back as 1968, and basically D'Addario went out and found the bottle and started, recommended it to Age, and then they started using it. And of course, it became the Blanton's bottle. That's what everybody knows it as now, but was not original to the brand.
Wow. And how often do you hear that you're paying for the bottle, or you're paying for the horse on top of the bottle, or something like that? Yeah. And that's actually what I want to get into next is, so, Blanton's went from this idea of selling bourbon 1 barrel at a time to, in the whiskey world, almost like the boogeyman. I mean, it's like, to enthusiasts, it's a controversial topic. To people who are just learning about bourbon, it's like the bourbon. It's like, I got to get my hands on it. I hear it at the liquor store all the time. I'm looking, at the shelf, and you're hearing people ask if there's Blanton's. How did
Yep.
we get here? is my biggest question, I think, is how did
Yeah.
we get from A to B?
I think specific to Blanton's and the drive and the popularity and the hype, I think fantastic marketing and great luck would be the way I would summarize that. And again, I reference this quite a bit and actually go into detail about this topic in the book. But effectively, hype has a tendency to sort of self perpetuate and grow. And Blanton's has these characteristics that make it a desirable bottle for the same reasons why I first kind of was attracted to the brand, and so many are. You've got the horse, the collectible horse. You've got the cool shape, the exclusivity of it, if you dare use that word, or difficulty finding it. I'll say, makes it that much more, desirable. You can't get it. If it was so easy to get, it probably wouldn't have the allure that it does. So I think you have all of these things combining, and the luck part of it is, I think kind of going back to what we just mentioned with the bottle design and the horse. Those were certainly marketing decisions that they made back in 1984. But I don't know that they got lucky that it was such a distinctive product, and it was such a distinctive look, I should say, for their packaging, for their bottles. The horse stopper itself was inspired by an antique wine stopper, and I actually have a picture of that inspirational wine stopper in my book. Diodarios, again, were the ones that designed that. And so, they got lucky. They created an iconic look back then that nobody else had. And I understand the current situation in the market where people make fun of people that are, like me. Oh, I've got to collect all the horses and stuff. I totally get that. But, to me, it's interesting because Blanton's really was original. They were the OGs, right? Now when I see other brands like collectible keys, I won't mention brand names, but, to me, they're the ones you should make fun of. Like, they're copying Blanton's was the OG. Now, yeah, is it overdone? Is it overblown? Do people celebrate the brand way more than they should? Yes. Probably one of the things I would say is do not hoard your Blantons. And I'm talking about the standard run-of-the-mill Blantons, even gold, straight from the barrel. Those are not unicorns. And I kind of feel bad for people that are, I found a bottle and I'm saving it till my son's 21st birthday. No, there are way better bottles you should use for that. Blanton's is fully obtainable. Granted, you may have to pay more than it's worth, but it is not a bottle that I think deserves that level of, I don't know, putting it on a pedestal. Unless it's maybe one of the more rare, very, very collectible versions. Standard Blanton's not a unicorn.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned how the horse topper was the original idea, and I want to pause there because I think it's important to note that if you call them out for doing a cliche, they're the ones who created the cliche. So it's like, as you mentioned, they're not the ones copying it. They came up with this idea. Now, was the horse stopper from the very beginning?
It was. Now, I will side note, in 1999, they added the letters. So early versions did not have the letters. So they definitely did, begin that sort of marketing tactic there in 99. But you go back to 99 and bourbon was still pretty much dead. It wasn't like they were capitalizing on a market of people that were flooding bourbon and really, buying up anything with Blanton's logo. Not at all. It was starting to have some signs of an uptick, but it certainly wasn't what it is today. So yeah, that was, still over 20 years ago that they made that change, and, can't help it. The bottles, it's cool. People want it, and even the guys who hate it, even the people who hate it, I think where I wrote the book from the mindset of, look, I can't just be a fanboy. I can't just glorify this brand other than to say, yes, we can argue about how it tastes and how it compares and if it's worth the price. And I'll probably agree with the people that are against Blanton's on those arguments. But from the historical perspective, that's where the brand has significance. And so, being, as we already talked about, the first single barrel, first widespread single barrel, it's historic. And it paved the way in a lot of ways for bourbon's comeback, which we've seen today, because it created a top shelf product, a premium product that really didn't exist. And other brands soon copied. You had other brands out there that created small batch started up, and other single barrels. And those created a strong top shelf for bourbon that didn't exist. And later down the road, that's, some of the first products that consumers gravitated towards as bourbon started its comeback. So Blanton sowed the seeds for that. And I think we should appreciate it, even if we want to disagree on sort of the current day market for the, and price point for what people are paying for Blantons.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, think about where the state of bourbon was when they came out with it. It was essentially like a monster of marketing, but the monster was created by the economic pressure. So it has kind of snowballed into this thing that we have today because it's still great marketing and it's still good bourbon.
Yeah.
But it's that's a very good point. It kind of pulled the bourbon industry back from a brink that it was on at the time.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, and I do have a couple of nerd questions I want to ask about it as well.
Oh, sure.
I think you and I are in agreement with a lot of things about. I've always told people I think it's a very good bourbon. I did a whole series of better than Blantons, and I do blind tastings versus Blantons, and I point out a lot of ones that are near its Ohio MSRP, so near that $60 mark. Some of them do way better than Blantons, and some of them are worse. For me, it's a fairly priced bourbon in Ohio. But I do still find the history of it and the history of the Buffalo Trace Distillery incredibly interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Yeah.
One aspect of that, they're known for these few mash bills that they do. And at the time, so when they came up with Blantons and they're like, we're going to pick out the honey barrels, was Blanton's essentially just a single barrel version of insert bourbon here, like it's just single barrel Buffalo Trace? I know that's not the case now, but is that how it kind of began?
Yeah, good question. So if you go back to the 80s, and even Buffalo Trace doesn't, their historians, their archives team doesn't have fantastic records. First off, you certainly didn't have near the number of bourbons produced today that as you did back then. Back then, it was primarily Ancient Age that was their big brand. And then Blanton's, and eventually Elmer T. Lee, Rock Hill Farms, Hancock's Residence Reserve, etc. So back then there was only a variety of bourbons they were producing, and mash bills likely differed back then. There's either no records of this, or more likely nothing that Buffalo Trace would ever share publicly. But back then you probably had more experimentation. You likely had longer aging happening. Due to the fact that bourbon wasn't in high demand, and so it sat there in the barrel longer. So there's no real good answer to your question, other than the mash bill back then probably fluctuated. And it's obvious that something has changed. If you taste, actually, right now I'm sipping on a '93 Blanton's, and it's not even the same bourbon. And that's not to say it's hands down better. It is better than the current product, but it's just a completely different flavor profile. You would never even put it in the same ballpark as today's product. And so, something has changed, and it's a combination of things. They do chill filter now, whereas back then they charcoal filtered. There's, as I mentioned, the aging likely being different, and potentially the mash bill. So, but it evolved. In 1991, you had Age International being purchased again by a Japanese company called Takara Shuzo. And when that happened, they acquired those, what we now know as Mash Bill 2 brands. So they are the owners of those brands I mentioned a moment ago. And then Buffalo Trace, what is now known as Buffalo Trace, the distillery itself, went on to develop, of course, their own products under different mash bills. So.
Mm-hmm. That's so at the time when they were picking out these barrels, it might have even been like, we don't know if that's going to end up being Ancient Age, what that's going to be, but it's a good barrel, so let's bottle it up and let's sell it as Blanton's. Wow.
Yeah, even now, I mean, what goes into Blanton's, at least what we're told from Buffalo Trace is that it is Mash Bill 2, and it could go into a variety. When they start it aging, it could go into a variety of products. Buffalo Trace uses, as do other distillers, a tasting board, a group of people essentially that their palates are honed in on the flavor profile for each brand, and so they try to effectively keep the brand within a certain realm of what they believe it should be, and then the bourbon that's not used for that brand, for example, for Blanton's, would then go into another mash bill number 2 product. So it might wind up in Ancient Age brand, which is going to be a lower tier product, lower MSRP. They might reject a barrel that maybe was intended for Blanton's, and it goes into that instead.
That's got to be a job. Where do I sign up for that?
Right.
Try their barrels.
I've noticed in all the videos I've seen and people I've talked to, though, unfortunately, in order to do that job well, you have to drink the bourbon and spit it out. And because if you keep consuming it, after about 10 minutes, you're probably not going to be very good at that job. So it does sound like a fun one.
It still might be worth it. It'd be hard to spit it out, but it might be worth it.
Yeah. Totally.
So along this journey, and I think you do cover a lot of this in your book, so I appreciate you divulging some of this to me. It certainly has me interested because this history, it's so hard to find, and I'm sure, as you said, you had to become an investigative reporter. So a couple of the things I really want to put a pin in, I really want to nail down is like, it was this great marketing idea that they had, and as you mentioned, it kind of pulled us out of this bourbon glut that we had at the time. Mm-hmm. At what point did it really like catch fire and become like this thing where it's like you can't just walk into a liquor store and get Blanton's anymore? Was it always that way? Or
no, that really didn't happen until probably. Well, it depends on where you're at, in the country, but if you're in a liquor control state like Ohio. Probably not till 2-3 years before COVID. I mean, I can remember, we'll say 2015. Again, it just depends. But I remember going into stores and paying MSRP like 2019 in Tennessee, for example. So it's out. It was out there, and even today, it just depends on if you time it right. I guess it depends on the states and how they do the bottle drops into the retail stores. But it is still possible to get lucky. I don't ever hope to find it, nor do I expect to see it on the shelf. And I definitely don't ask for it. That's got to be the most annoying question that a liquor store employee gets. Or if you're outside of Ohio, maybe asking for Weller too. That's we have plenty of it here, but out there, I hear it's pretty hard to come by. So that's those are tough ones.
We're very lucky with the Weller. I actually managed to snag a full proof last year, which I was really excited about. But
very cool.
Yeah.
That's very
so good. I guess is it just a matter that it was the perfect monster of marketing in the age of like Instagram and TikTok that it just like exploded?
Yeah, in the late, we'll say 2008, 2009, you definitely see this uptick of bourbon getting mentioned as social media took off. You see it in Hollywood and movies starting to, kind of grow from there. So with that, you definitely, it was, I think, a couple different forces that grew together. And then you had this generation coming up, people that they wanted something more than just, vodka, which was a staple. Right? You go back to the bars and the clubs in the early 2000s, and it was vodka. But, as you kind of graduate beyond that, you want something with a little more flavor. Whiskey was there, and it was sort of this untouched world because, and this, again, another topic from the book, the people such as myself, my parents' generation, the baby boomers, were not drinking whiskey. That's one of the reasons why it suffered so much throughout the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, was because they rejected it. And so it was this the most popular distilled spirit in America up until the late 60s, I believe. And so with that, it traditionally was this amazing product, but it had this grisly sort of masculine vibe to it, cowboy image. And the baby boomers rejected it. They didn't want it. They went to the vodkas and the gins, wine. Meanwhile, as I've said earlier, you've got Japan who came along and they embraced that masculine sort of American image. And it took a while for Americans to come back around. So that this generation shifted again. And by the early 2000s, there was this, new group of sort of your Gen Xers and, now millennials and so forth that really just, it became cool and it just sort of snowballed. So.
Okay, and I guess it kind of makes sense, if it was made for such good marketing that then after that generation went away and you had this generation that kind of grew up at least learning the internet and then on the internet, that
Yeah,
marketing hit the internet and then it just became this, like, it was like a catalyst for it to just take off
yeah.
again. I just killed my first bottle of
Well,
Blanton's that I have. I mean, I have a second bottle over there, but
nice,
what a
nice.
never a better time to kill a bottle of Blanton's than when you're
Listen, a
learning
bottle
all
kills
about
good.
it, right?
I do have a few rare ones, and for the people watching, I can show these. This
Yes.
here is something very special. This is I don't know if you can see that, but it's 141.9 proof. This is the
Wow.
highest proof Buffalo Trace has ever bottled Blanton's, and this is the only known bottle to exist. This is one of only three in this label, which is a metallic label. It's called My Only Blanton's, and so this was a release that was done for private customers in Japan. It was basically a exclusive barrel pick program where you could buy the entire barrel, and this was back in 2007, 2006, and you could buy the whole barrel. They made this cool label, and obviously it all went to Japan. There was only a few barrels made. I think I have all the stats, of course, in the book or on my website, but only a few
Yeah.
barrels of it. And so there weren't that many bottles to begin with. And this particular proof, they were all, each barrel was a different proof. This 141.9 is confirmed to be the highest. So I was able to acquire this from Japan through a network of people, but there's probably more out there. Probably the original owner of this barrel may have some in, his or her house, but this is the only known one. So 141.9 proof. I'd love to try it, but could never bring myself to open that bottle.
So yeah, so you're saying not only was it a rare program that they had these barrels, but that
Right.
specific barrel was the highest proof of all of that
Highest proof.
program.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. Of all time.
Now, as you mentioned, you haven't opened that one yet. Of the ones you have opened, do you see huge variation in the taste or the profile, or what's that experience like?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I would say that by and large, standard Blantons, which you're drinking 93 proof over there,
Hmm.
more or less taste consistent because again there's a consistent profile that they try to maintain, and I'm using some
Hmm.
pretty wide boundaries here. There are variations from bottle to bottle. Maybe 1 out of 10 that I'll have from a current day release will just be exceptionally better. Maybe one
Okay.
out of 10 will be pretty hard to drink. I've had that too, where there's just somewhere. I've even had some store picks that you think, okay, it's a store pick, it's probably going to be pretty good. And there's been some that, maybe the bourbon was stored in the window or something because this is just not good. It got hot in
Yeah.
the sun or something. But yeah, I think by and large you see consistent with the current products. I think where you see the big variation is where you get into the olders, the dusty Blantons. As I mentioned earlier, that it's just significantly different. Those dusty bottles from the 80s and 90s are highly coveted, valuable, but they're also exceptional drinkers. More often than not, you run a risk as the bourbon is that old. You run a risk of potentially some sort of contamination, or if air got into the bottle or something. You have
Yeah.
some challenges there. It could have been stored in the sun, as I mentioned, but generally pretty exceptional stuff. This 93 that I actually just finished off as well is just, I wish I could drink that all day long because it's hands down better than today's product. So
Wow. Now, would you say across all of the different Blanton's labels they're producing today, they're pretty consistent as well?
yeah, I mean consistent within that each proof point. So you've got gold at
Okay.
103 proof. I wouldn't compare the different proof points to one another because there obviously
Hmm.
is intended variation there with the different proofs, um, and certainly nuances with that. But yeah, within each product line, I mean they're putting out a pretty good consistent product there. I think what I recommend
Yeah.
to people, how I change, for the people out there that say, Blanton says I can't stand it, it's just not my favorite bourbon, blah blah blah. Okay, fine. And again, I don't fully disagree with those sentiments, but seek out at least a sample of a one of the more exclusive special varieties that they produce. The La Maison du Whiskey for France every year, the special releases, which are European releases. These are the ones that people tend to see some pretty high values on. $1,000, $2,000. and they're still new, right? I'm not talking about dusty versions of that stuff. I'm talking about the current releases. It's expensive. Is it still overpriced at those price points? Yes. I don't know that any bourbon's really worth that much. It's more about the exclusivity of drinking it than how good can it really taste. But point being, those are still exceptional Blantons. I mean, I've turned Blanton's haters into momentary Blanton's lovers just from sips of bottles like that, because they're hand selected and they're done for these, 2 or 3 barrels for an exclusive release. Of course, they're going to pick something that tastes amazing. So it's
right.
highly recommended.
Now, you might be more qualified than anybody to tell us what in your opinion is a fair price for the run of the mill Blanton's 93 proof. What's a fair price for that?
Great question. So easy, $60, $70, that MSRP. I think that's fair. It is not bad bourbon. It is really good bourbon more often than not. It is not worth double, triple, some of those where you see, prices online. It's not, as far as the taste goes. I mean, it'd be hard to argue that it was. If somebody out there is consistently paying that much because they love the flavor of Blanton so much, they should participate in some blind tests, taste tests, because I have a feeling it's just in their head. And now I say that not to hate on Blantons. It's just that's where I feel the price point is. Now,
yeah.
The other point though is, if you really want it and you've never had a bottle, right? You're new, just like your channel, Whiskey Noobs, right? You're new to bourbon and you just like, man, I want a bottle. And these guys are talking about it and stuff. Well, then find one. And if you have to pay double for it, that's okay. I wouldn't do that consistently, but I don't think the online hatred towards those who, kind of pay a little bit extra for Blantons is warranted. If that person is just kind of getting into it and just trying to get a bottle for the first time, I think it's worth that.
I'm right with you there. I say that all the time, not just about Blantons, because I think Blantons, as I mentioned, when I do my blind tastings, I pick stuff a little bit more expensive, a little bit less expensive, and it's always it lands at around that $60 mark for me. I tell people that same thing with Buffalo Trace, because in some areas it's hard to find, and I've had people be so disappointed because they paid $60 or something for the bottle of Buffalo Trace, and I always try to say it's not a $60 bottle. It's a
right.
It's a little bit better than the $27 that they're asking for it. And I think for Buffalo Trace and for Blanton's, that is one of the reasons that we see that hate online that you're talking about, is because people build it up in their mind to be this just amazing bourbon.
Yep.
And they think it's worth that $150, $120, but it's not. It's only worth it if you're, like you said, doing it to try it for the first time.
Yeah. You really want it. You really want it for the first time. You've never had it. And if you're like me, I would do that versus go wait in line. Put my chair out, camp out. No, it's that time is money also, right? So if you're doing something productive with that time that you're not wasting camping in line somewhere, then, what's the big deal? As long as you don't consistently pay that much, then there shouldn't be that much hatred. And kind of to your point around, the flavor and is it worth it? I'm obviously a Blanton's guy. I don't really have an extensive bottle. Unlike most people, my bar in my basement there's not a lot of stuff. I have things that people give me, and I'll sort of, buy whatever I'm feeling for that week or that month. But, it's whatever, it's up to you. You're the individual, go for what you like. Albert T. Lee drank his bourbon with 7-Up or Sprite. That's how he liked it, and he's a legend, right? So, we should drink it the way we want. We should drink what we want. I would argue, is Pappy 23 worth it? I mean, how many blind tests does it come out on top? It's right. It's all hype, right? It's all hype. And at the end of the day, there's plenty of good bourbon out there that won't break the bank.
So you can confirm the old Elmer T. Lee thing. That's true. That's how he was drinking.
Yes, absolutely. He's on record saying it. Yep.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I haven't seen that. I'll have to look.
Yeah, I mean, here's a legend.
Yeah. That's really interesting to me. People bring that up a lot of times online, and that's, drink it the way that you want to drink it. I always say that,
who cares?
But I think that's another controversy online that gets overblown sometimes. And as a short form content creator. I'll make some videos kind of poking fun at different,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
oh, drinking it on ice, oh, mixing it, and
Yeah.
people don't like that very much when
Yeah.
I
Well,
do. Some of them
just,
do.
yeah, it's just like his Jack Daniel's bourbon, right? It's like you get this whole,
Yeah.
it's yeah, you're never going to win these arguments. The battles will continue forever.
That they will. That they will. Now, you mentioned you don't have a ton of other stuff on your bar, but I did want to ask, do you have a favorite bourbon outside of Blanton's or even all the way outside the Buffalo Trace Distillery?
People ask me that a lot because, again, you would think for a guy like me who is this much into Blanton's, at least as a collector and a historian, I would be this super big whiskey guy. And the reality is, I don't. I mean, I guess I'll admit this publicly. I like Woodford Reserve. It just standard old Woodford Reserve. It's available. I can find it. It's good. Maker's Mark on occasion will hit me. I kind of graduated from that a little bit. No offense to Maker's fans. But yeah, I don't have much of a go-to. I kind of drink anything. So gifted bottles are awesome. Like people come over and they, like behind me here, there's a couple, maybe an Angel's Envy that just showed up here in the last couple days. So, that's going to be a good one to crack here soon. I don't really have sort of something that I probably have a list of ones I don't like more than I like, I guess would be, but even then after a glass, who really cares?
Right. Wow. Yeah, no, it sounds like that's your profile. And I think, as you've mentioned too, the history of it is so intriguing, and that's what makes
what I'm into.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we got a taste of here, and that is what we can read more about in this book. And obviously, I mean, you've been an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I'm interested in it because more than I think any other distillery right now, Buffalo Trace is victim to online rumor so much. So it'll be good to really clear that up a little bit, I think.
Yeah, they have so many coveted products, and so many of their products are allocated now, and so you just have tons of rumors, tons of speculation, and I'm almost glad that I'm not quite as into whiskey across the board or bourbon across the board, because I probably care more about some of those, when's the next bottle drop for whatever. And I kind of don't pay much attention to that stuff. I'm more interested in when the next rare Blanton's release is going to come out, and can I get one for my collection? And that's what makes me a little different than most. But yeah, the book's got a lot of history. There's a lot of things I haven't mentioned, right? But there really goes deep into a lot of areas, and I've gotten great feedback so far from across the gamut, other whiskey authors, respected people who I respect, and think, wow, this is going to kind of, if I can impress them, then that's going to be cool. And so it's written again not as just a fanboy for the brand. It's something that everybody should be able to pick up and learn something from. And very much, as I've articulated here on our conversation today, very much I don't shy away from going and talking about what makes Blanton's polarizing. In fact, there's a whole chapter talking about the polarization of Blanton's and how it's a love it or hate it, and all the tater culture, and so I probably take more hate than anyone. People make fun of me online, and I grab pictures of my basement bar and laugh at it and stuff. I don't mind, right? I love it. It's kind of like bring it on. And in the book, I make sure to explore all that and not shy away from it. So I'm hard pressed to think somebody would read it and, really think that I'm just a fanboy that's sold out. And, it's a fair book is my point.
I like to hear that. And I like, it seems like, obviously you are a fan of Blanton's, but you're a fanboy who recognizes he's a fanboy. So it's not the same as being biased, right?
Exactly. Maybe it's worse though, because I'm totally aware of it, but I still do it. I don't know.
Hey, it's good to have self-awareness, I suppose.
That's right. So,
now, what I want to wrap up with, because there's a lot of people listening, especially, like you said, whiskey noobs, there are a lot of folks listening who are maybe newer to the hobby, and they're hearing all this controversy. They're hearing that Blanton's is bottom shelf toilet water, and they're hearing that Blanton's is the best bourbon that you can get your hands on, and it's just pay any amount of money that you can get for it. Yep. To somebody sitting at home right now, never had a bottle, they're hearing all this controversy. If you just had any main advice to them or any statement, what would you say?
Certainly. So first off, again, get it if you want it. and you don't have it and you've never had it, find one. And find one to me, and there's all different ways to do it. I think the outside of just driving around and wasting time, the best legal way to get it is look at online auction houses or online liquor stores. So auction houses such as Unicorn Auctions, based here in the U.S., or different European auction houses that can ship legally to the U.S. Those are fantastic ways to get it. Again, you're going to pay a premium, but it's a pretty safe bet, right? You can't guarantee anything, but pretty safe way to get it. Same thing with online liquor stores. There's multiple websites which are well known. You want to vet it first. You want to make sure it's one that's that's reputable. And there are different rules about shipping to different states, so your mileage may vary. Do your homework, but there's plenty of ways to find Blantons if you're willing to pay a little bit and do it legally. So I would say go for it. Get your bottle, and that's how I'm not ashamed to admit it. It's how early in my collecting journey, I really wanted I think it was the special release, the green Blanton's green bottle, 80 proof, really nothing special. I couldn't find it through any of my sources, and I just went online, found a reputable source, and was able to buy it through one of those websites. So do your homework, though. Don't no private message deals. No don't ads that solicit you and you click on. You got to be careful. Like again, winesearcher.com is a website I'd recommend for finding good stores. Yeah.
And please, if somebody's commenting on my post and saying, "Hey, DM me," and they spelled something wrong, please don't DM them, please.
don't DM. No, none of that. So.
Oh my goodness! Now, is it safe? Yeah. Is it safe to say, if you're going to spend that money, to just acknowledge you're spending more than it might be worth to you, but you're spending it so that you can specifically try that whiskey? But just be aware it's probably not going to be worth that $120, that $150 that you're paying.
Yeah, I think that frames it up very well. I think that's a perfect way to, it's really just, I got to have it and I want to try it, and I'm willing to pay a premium, and it's the culture we live in today sometimes that we're willing to do that. So yeah, that's 100% how I'd say it. And, I think I would not recommend buying it at that quantity or at that price and hanging on to it for 5-10 years, thinking that it's going to somehow be a bottle worth kind of keeping around. They're making plenty of it. In fact, they bottle up to 10,000 bottles a day in Blanton Distilling Hall on the campus. So they're making a ton of it, making it as fast as they can. And I'll leave a teaser for everyone. I go into detail about that in the book as well, and how perhaps not all Blantons is aged fully in warehouse age. So.
Oh, that is. I need to. I'm like going to skip ahead now and read about that.
I think it's chapter 12 or something like that. Yeah, right. Yeah. So there's, there's a little bit of history there, but there's plenty of it. Is the point? This is not, again, it's not a unicorn. You just gotta convince, or find one of your bourbon buddies that's hoarding it and has 10 bottles in their basement, right? Something like that.
Right. Make them let you try it.
Right.
Well, Dominic, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate all this information. I'm a whiskey nerd. I love learning about it. Where can people find your book at?
So they can find it either at my website, warehouseh.com, or blantonsbook.com. Those are the two best places. It is also available on Amazon. I appreciate the copies I sell through my website directly, because I do autograph all those. So if you want it autographed, buy it at blantonsbook.com and it will be autographed.
Awesome. Good to know. And I'll throw those links down in the description for you guys who want to click on them and be able to go find the book. And then you can read up on all this stuff we talked about as well, and quite a bit more. And I'm excited to unravel some more of that. So thank you once again. Thank you for coming on. This has been a blast for me.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for listening to another episode of Whiskey Noobs. If you need more Whiskey Noobs content in your life, make sure you check out our Patreon page in the show notes. And if you like the show, please make sure to leave a 5-star rating or review. It only takes a couple of minutes, and they're way more helpful than people realize. If you want to do tastings alongside the show, make sure you join the email list by sending an email to whiskeynoobspodcast@gmail.com with a subject line that says email list. You'll receive monthly emails with a list of the whiskeys that will be featured throughout the month so that you can buy them ahead of time. You can also find more Whiskey Noobs content on Instagram at @whiskey_noobs and on TikTok at Whiskey Noobs Podcast. Once again, thank you guys for listening. The Whiskey Noobs Podcast does not support underage or otherwise irresponsible consumption of alcohol.